My original plan for today was to tell you a funny story from college about the end of Western civilization and the origins of the First World War. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the thing that happened to me in college had also happened to me once in high school. And there's something to the idea of the inertia of reputation. So that's what I want to talk about today. Welcome to the Inris Files, thoughts on pop culture, history, and the human condition from a very specific Generation X point of view. By the way, if you'd like to engage in these topics, whether you agree or disagree, you can do so free at my community on the Skool platform. Check out somethinginconspicuous.com. When I was in college, I didn't really know what my major was going to be when one of my friends asked me, "So what's your major?" I had originally been admitted into the math department, but my freshman year, and I've mentioned this before, my freshman year, since I had a whole bunch of math credits that I was going to be carrying in from previous work that I'd done, I figured, hey, what if freshman year I just take nothing but electives, and then I can really hunker down and take care of nothing but math and science for the rest of my time at the university. And my academic advisor, who was in the math department, said, "Yeah, that sounds like a great idea." So I signed up for American History 101, Russian History 101. I took Russian language. I signed up for Psych 101, and I probably took Social 101 at some point, and discovered that there are much more interesting things that you can study in the classroom than math. Whereas I could get jobs on campus doing math. I worked at the synchrotron. I worked in the language lab, programming, that kind of thing. So then my second year in college, I'm like, yeah, I think I'm going to continue to study these topics instead of the more practical computer programming and mathematics. And much to the disappointment of my math advisor, my academic advisor in the math department. But at some point, it was either late that second year or early the third year, somebody said, "So what are you going to declare as your major?" I hadn't even thought about it. And I asked him for advice. I was like, I completely blanked on the idea that I even had to declare a major. There were some gaps in my education about how college is supposed to work. And he said, "Well, we know each other from a couple of history classes. Why don't you major in history?" So I looked at the number of classes I was taking, and it looked like it would be very easy for me to fulfill the requirements of the history major. And also, while I was at it, to fulfill the requirements of a Russian and Soviet studies major. And they have a bunch of classes that overlap. So I went ahead and I declared both of those as my majors. However, for the history degree, you were required to take as a prerequisite world history, or not world history, Western civilization, 151 and 152. Most people take that their first year in college. Hence, the first digit in the number of any course tells you what year it typically is taken. So 151, typically taken your first year. And I hadn't taken it. And I hadn't taken it my second year. In fact, there was no room for me to take it during my third year. But I did take another class my third year that bears mentioning. And it is, I think, absolutely my most favorite class that I took while I was at university as an undergrad. It was in the history department, and it was the origins of the First World War. It was taught by three different professors. One was the Russian history professor, who happened to be my advisor by the time I switched over to a history major. The other was a German history professor, who was absolutely amazing. I'd never taken any classes with her before, but I very quickly just really appreciated everything. Every time she gave a lecture, it was just amazing. And then the third professor was a professor of British history. He was very good, by the way. But again, the professor who was teaching German history was a revelation. And I discovered in the course of taking that one semester that more had happened in any 30-year period in Germany than had happened in Russia during any 300-year period. That may sound like an exaggeration, but it was stunning to me how it didn't matter where you sliced those 30 years in German history. So much had happened and had transformed the way people in the region lived. And she had a delivery style that was very understated, but excited. There was this current of passion running just beneath the surface of everything that she taught. And it was just amazing to behold. The professors of this particular class would then not only teach from the perspective of their specialties, those 3 countries, but they would also teach from the perspective of 3 other specific countries. So the professor of English history also taught from the perspective of Italy. The Russian professor taught from the perspective of France, and then the German history professor taught from the perspective of the United States. By the way, I just realized I got them confused. It doesn't matter. The point is, these 3 other nations were taught by the professors who also specialized in their own particular field. And on top of that, every lecture would focus on either one of those 6 countries, or it would focus on a particular issue area: economics, religion, culture, previous history, and traditions. And so any given lecture was very narrowly focused. And this particular class essentially picked up somewhere around 1880, something like that. And then it ran through the end of the 1800s and the very beginning of the 1900s. We studied the Knights of the Templar. We studied the Crimean Wars, the Balkan crises. In fact, in a lot of ways, the First World War could be referred to as the Fourth Balkan Crisis. Why didn't the first 3 erupt into a world war, but the 4th one did? And again, I took these classes decades ago, and if I'm getting some numbers wrong, I hope you will indulge me. That said, it was an amazing class, and I learned so much, and there were so many interesting characters from that time. Otto von Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm, and for that matter, President Woodrow Wilson. And the way the people spoke about the events as they were unfolding. And not only that, I began to understand Einstein's theory of general relativity by what I learned in this particular class, because depending upon your point of view, determined who actually was the first to mobilize for World War I. And the class ended right at that mobilization, when Russia mobilized and Austria mobilized with regard to Serbia. Don't worry, there won't be a test at the end of this talk. This isn't really what the talk is about. The point is, it was a fascinating class, and at the time, I paid rapt attention because I was so fascinated by everything that they were teaching. And it was a very intense and rewarding experience to spend an entire semester studying this very narrow topic. How in the world did all of the major and many of the minor nations of the planet engage in a world war at this particular moment in history? It is something that I think bears understanding even today. They say those who fail history are condemned to repeat it. There's a little joke there. But those who don't study history can often end up repeating the same mistakes from history, which is why I think it is relevant to today. Whatever day you happen to be watching this video, whether you're watching it the day after I record it or whether you're watching it 20 years in the future, I'm absolutely convinced that the lessons from this point in history remain germane. That said, I was finally able to squeeze Western civilization into my coursework my fourth and final year as an undergrad. It was taught by a professor named L. Pierce Williams. He is one of my favorite professors from university, and he's also one of the only professors I never really approached. As a general rule, our classes were small enough, and the classes were taught in such an engaging style that the students were actually encouraged to ask questions, and they would frequently ask questions in the middle of lecture as well as at the very end. Sometimes at the end of a lecture, students would go down to where the professor was and they would ask questions after the formal class was over. This was very common, and I got to know most of my professors while I was an undergrad. L. Pierce Williams was one of the very few I never approached. I also think he may have discouraged people coming down and chatting with him after class, but I may be mistaken about that. Well, the thing about Western civilization 151 and 152 is that they were very large classes, and they were very large classes because so many people had to take it as a prerequisite in order to become a history major. So I had a TA for a teaching assistant for both semesters, 151 and 152. Same TA both times. And he was a graduate student from England. And he was just a fascinating guy, but he was also a very, very good discussion leader. And the whole point of, so we would have 3 lectures a week, but then we would also have, I think it was 2 labs or 2 separate discussion sections. And there were several TAs for this particular class, because again, there were so many students. But this was where you got together in very small groups and you were able to discuss the important topics that you wouldn't otherwise get to discuss in an intimate setting because the class was so large. The class was set up so that really you could master everything you needed to master just by attending the lecture and paying attention. There were reading assignments, and of course, the discussions helped a lot to learning the material. When all was said and done, each semester, there were 2 midterm exams and then 1 final exam. The midterm exams where I went to college were called prelims, as in preliminary exams. I don't know how many universities call them prelims, but I've heard that it's not very common. Anyway, in the second semester, so 152, so this is near the end, the very end of my time as an undergraduate. We're getting closer to the end of the class, and we had a section on World War I. And the prelim essentially said you had a couple of you had an essay question, and the essay was restricted to 2 to 3 pages. And the question was, assess blame for the First World War. Now, it was a relatively small unit in the class, but I had, the previous year, taken an entire semester focused on nothing but that specific question. And I am thinking about all of the many things you could talk about with regard to the origins of the First World War, but we were restricted to 2 to 3 pages. Now, you may not believe this to hear me now, but back when I was in college, I struggled for the first few years to write as much in the essays that we were assigned to write as the page count guidance had been given us. So if we were told to write a 2 to 3 page paper, I struggled to get 2 full pages in. A lot of this just had to do with how I thought about writing and all the rest of this. Now, by senior year, I had become quite adept at writing good academic papers, and they did. If I was told to write 6 pages, I could write 6 pages. We were still typically assigned 2 to 3 page papers. However, with regard to the First World War, I was struck by this interesting challenge, and that is, how do I convey that I actually know my stuff and keep it down to 2 to 3 pages? I don't think that could be done because there's so much that went into what caused the First World War. And I decided to go out on a limb and do something that I very rarely did. And given that my TA, he was a good guy, he was a very good guy, but he was British. And as an American student, or somebody who was raised in the United States, as we all were in that teaching that section, he seemed a little more formal, just a little bit more formal. And so I wasn't sure if I could get away with kind of violating the norms. But in this particular case, the norm is if you're assigned 2 to 3 pages, you write 2 to 3 pages. And I was banking on the idea that as long as I can convey that I know the topic, that I would get the A. But I decided that the only way to get away with that was to have a little bit of fun with it. And this was not something I would typically do, especially for this particular class. This is my final semester. I have to pass this class in order to get my history major. And yet, this was just begging for me to mock the fact that the question restricted us to 2 to 3 pages. So what I did was I ended up writing what was essentially a comedy piece. It ended up being about 11, 12 pages long. But I figured as long as the first 2 pages make it clear that I know what I'm talking about, if he chooses not to read the rest, we're good. But maybe if I made it entertaining enough, he would read the rest. So what I did was in the very first paragraph, I said, when it comes to assessing blame in the First World War, this is not a difficult question. It says in Article 321 of the Versailles Treaty that Germany was to blame for the cause of World War I. Footnote number 1. And then down in the footnote, I said, Treaty of Versailles, Article 321. And then I continued, now that we have dispensed with assessing the blame for the cause of the First World War, I would like to address on a case-by-case basis other factors that led to the origin of the First World War. I'm going to start with the accusative case, move on to the generative case, and I used a bunch of linguistic terms using cases as a part of speech as applying that instead as cases in history. Anyway, it was a pun. You had to be there. Then I went down country by country by country and talked about their respective role. And in each case, I decided the way I was going to approach it was I was going to make the case that that country was actually to blame. I spent the most time on England because my TA was from England. And I must have spent 2 to 3 pages just blaming England for the cause of the First World War, which, if you know anything about the cause of the First World War, is silly. But I had to do it. I also had a section in there for Switzerland, and under the heading Switzerland, I wrote, just kidding. If you're not a student of history, you may not be aware, Switzerland has always been famous, especially during the 19th and 20th centuries, for its neutrality. It's actually been recognized as a neutral power, and nations have gone to great lengths to not involve Switzerland in their European wars. So Just kidding. And then I turned it in. And again, it was a risk, but it was a very calculated risk, and I'm good at math. We get the papers back. And my TA had written in big bold letters on the front of the page, on the front page of the whole thing, F, see remarks. And I turned it over and it said, just kidding. And he had given me an A. I should say I had earned an A. Anyway, so that was funny. And I talked with him about it later. And he said that he had deliberately held my prelim to the last, or at least until he got so bored out of his mind, because he knew that at least when he read mine, it would be something interesting. And I don't know. I mean, I was inordinately pleased with myself when he said that. I guess by this point I had actually learned to write compellingly. I don't know. But something that it also reinforced was this idea that your reputation matters. I could have just written a pedestrian essay and it would have been fine, because he was just hoping that I would establish that I had paid attention in class and that I could string coherent thoughts together. The fact that I went above and beyond and actually tried to entertain him was a bonus, I guess, for him as well as for me. And that's lovely. But I had a reputation for paying attention in class so that my essays were not a complete waste of time. And apparently, some of the essays weren't as strong. And so my intention was to tell you this funny story about how I had blamed Switzerland for the origins of the First World War and how I got an A for that. But as I was thinking about this, it occurred to me I had done this once before, my senior year in high school. And what had happened in high school was we had European, actually this might have been junior year, which is the third year of high school, the second to last year, if you don't use the common parlance of American schools. It was European history, once again, and our teacher didn't always pay a lot of attention to how big the assignments were that she was handing out. And sometimes they were completely manageable, sometimes they were really easy, and every once in a while there was just too much. And on this one particular occasion, we had a bunch of homework and a bunch of other classes. I was taking the honors track, and there were a bunch of other kids who were taking the honors track. And those of us who were taking that track, we had a bunch of homework and a bunch of other classes. And then she gives us this huge list of questions, right? So it's from the textbook, answer questions 1 through 50, odd numbered. Okay, so we're going to answer all of the odd numbered questions from 1 to whatever. And in this case, a short answer was a paragraph. Thank goodness it wasn't 2 to 3 pages. But it was a lot. And so a friend of mine who was also a top performer in the class, he and I decided that what we were going to do was we were going to collaborate on, we were going to work through this together because it would be faster for us to do it that way. However, and he had a word processor. Ooh, this is fancy technology at the time. He had a word processor. So we would type it up on his computer, and then we would change the fonts so that it didn't look like they were the same. But it occurred to me, smart child that I was, pardon me, what if she actually does recognize that we're saying the same things verbatim? It could happen. So we printed up. Again, we had worked on this together, and this was at a time when collaborating on your homework was a no-no. You weren't supposed to do that, especially for essay questions. So it would have been discouraged that we had worked together on this. When I say discouraged, I mean it would have been labeled as cheating, and we would have gotten zeros for our assignment. But of course, the goal was to get very high grades on our assignment, which is why we wanted to complete the assignment. We printed up one copy, and that was his copy after we had finished and formulated all of the answers to all of these questions. By the way, if you're one of my children watching this, yes, I cheated on this one homework assignment. Just so you know, I'm not proud of it, except yes, I am. So it occurred to me she might actually notice if the turns of phrase were exactly the same. And since we still had a tiny bit of time left before I had to go home and then we were going to work on our other homework assignments separately, I was like, I'd like to go through and insert some jokes because I think that's going to distract from the writing otherwise. And he's like, all right, yeah, let's do that. So we went through. I don't remember any of the jokes except for one, and that is in this one paragraph answer to a short question. It had something to do with when the Danes invaded some country or some other nation state, and I decided to just do a whole riff on that. And I said, these Danes weren't particularly great. Great Danes would be later. These were more like medium Danes, something like that. Every time I injected something, it was a pun, because that was a style of humor that I was known for at the time. And then we printed that up in a different font and all the rest of that. We go to class. We turn in our papers from different parts of the room or different part of the stack. And then we wait to get busted. We got our papers back. Now remember, they were exactly identical, except I had inserted a bunch of jokes. And with so many questions, I wasn't even able to do it for all of them. I might have, maybe half of them I might have doctored just a tiny bit. But other than that, our answers were identical because we worked together on the answers. I got an A, and my friend got a B+ for the same answers. It was interesting, and we both noticed. We talked about this. Why did you get an A? Why did I get a B+? And it was absolutely a worthy question. My friend was every bit as capable, every bit as smart. I dare say he was really, really, really sharp, and he went on to do great things after high school. He was a good guy. He was friendly and outgoing. It's not like, oh, he had a reputation for being a troublemaker or anything like that. He was a good guy, and he did well in classes. He finished that class with an A average, as everyone would have expected. I finished with an A average as everyone would have expected, but my A average was just a little bit higher than his A average, partially because of that one homework exercise. And I think at the end of the day, the teacher certainly was not reading carefully through every single answer. It was a hefty homework assignment, and she had to get them graded and turned back in the same amount of time as she would have done any of the other assignments, but this one was just too big. I don't think it is possible that she could have read closely everything that was there. My guess is if she spot checked mine and she spot checked his, she probably hit a couple of mine that had those jokes in it. She probably chuckled at it and then continued on down. And then by the time she spot checked his, if she happened to spot check the same particular question, she didn't notice that the writing was the same because, again, 35 kids per class. She's teaching at least 2 or 3 European history classes at the time. Whether or not the others were honors, I can't remember. But the point is, She had a lot of papers to grade. It is easy to say, yeah, okay, she didn't. It's reasonable that she might not have recognized that the writing was essentially the same. That being said, because we had put the same caliber of effort into the entire homework assignment, we're left with, she found whatever level of competency that she had expected from our respective papers or homework assignments. And she just on this particular occasion, my reputation with her was probably a tiny bit higher than his. Maybe one of my jokes struck her the right way or whatever, and she decided to give me a little bonus because I happened to make her reading of the homework a little less onerous. I don't know. But that was a lesson that had stuck with me for a while. Nothing is fair. Grading is not necessarily fair, especially when it's something as subjective as short answer essays. And your reputation carries with it a certain amount of inertia. I noticed this in a chemistry class that I had taken in high school. The chemistry teacher was known to be lenient to members of the school's hockey team. I will note I went to a high school that was on the border with Canada. Hockey was absolutely a pastime of my hometown. And he had a reputation for being lenient in terms of grading for the hockey students. I don't know. I know I had a great rapport with him. I liked him. He was a good teacher. The homework assignments were consistent and fair, and he was a lot more consistent with the assignments than my European history teacher. But there were something I had figured out after a little while was that, and this is where, again, you get to know who your professors are, who your teachers are, who your teaching assistants are. As your rapport with them develops, you kind of get a sense for how lenient and how strict you need to be on any given assignment. I had one of my favorite high school teachers was an English teacher, and I had him both for my third and fourth year honors classes, and he was very, very strict. He would not let you get away with anything, and the English had to be perfect. The points had to be well articulated. They had to show thought. They had to show that you had read the material that you were commenting on. I had a great reputation with him. I had a great rapport with him, but I didn't mess around on his homework assignments. My chemistry teacher, at some point what would happen is he would give us 5 questions a night when he would give us homework. And then on those occasions, we would turn in the papers, and the next day he would grade them while we were working on something that had to do with the next lesson. And he would occasionally shout out observations or whatever as he was grading. Not very often, but he would grade them during the class and then hand them all back at the end of class. Don't know how he did it. Didn't know how he did it until I figured out how he did it. On one occasion, I wrote in question number 3 out of 5, I wrote the answer as I normally would, but I included at the end, I sometimes wonder if Mr. Vella actually reads these. Or I sometimes wonder how closely Mr. Vella reads these. And he never commented on that. I would get it back, and I was getting them right. I was always getting 5 points for each of them because this was a class I paid attention to. But when he didn't comment on that, I continued to do that, and I continued to up the ante. I started to make more and more remarks of a humorous nature, always well-intentioned. I was never mean about anything. I was never cutting anybody down. And I would do it for 2 out of the 5. And I would change which 2. And then one day in the middle of class, while we're working on whatever our next thing is, and he's grading this particular homework assignment, and the classroom is silent because we're all working on this next thing. And he says very loudly, he said, "Yes, Mr. Inris, I do, in fact, read these," which established that he hadn't read them the previous occasions. Of course, from that point on, he read mine a little more closely. So now I felt like I had to occasionally inject these things, but I also had to be very careful to make sure I was getting the answers right. And here we are. So my Western civilization class comes to an end, and that's the end of that. I wanted to comment on something that L. Pierce Williams had said during our final lecture. I'm going to save that for another day, because right at the moment, I just kind of want to focus on that idea that your reputation has inertia that carries you over any particular bump in the road. Or if you have a bad reputation, a smooth spot in the road. It takes a while to build a reputation, and that reputation can just continue to pull you forward, whether for good or for ill, until you have done enough to overcome that. The Buffalo Bills had been a very successful football team during the era that after I had graduated from college. And I read a book that was written by the coach of the Buffalo Bills during these amazing seasons. His name is Marv Levy. The name of the book is Where Else Would You Rather Be? If you have an opportunity to read it, it is one of the best books I have read, written by a sports coach about peak performance. But he dropped this bon mot in the middle of the book on one occasion, and when I read it, I commented on it to my wife at the time, and I said, he says here that if you establish a reputation for always showing up at 6 a.m., you can get away with sleeping until noon. To which my wife said, if you get a reputation for sleeping until noon, you can get away with sleeping until noon. And she is absolutely right, which is something that I have proven to be literally true later on in life. But this is that point. This is the point that this coach had made, and it's true. When you get a reputation, that reputation will continue to carry you through, again, whether for good or ill. I've repeated myself 3 times now, so I think I'm going to stop with the repetition. That repetition may be an extension of something I had done when I was an 8th grade math teacher. Or maybe it's just because my brain is wired funny. I don't know. Regardless, I hope you found this entertaining. Thanks for checking out another entry from the Inris Files. Until next time, keep your mind open and your thinking sharp.